Good afternoon. The Aboriginal name for the Hunters Hill area is Mu-Kabula, which means meeting of waters. The Hunters Hill area was inhabited by the Willamilgal clan prior to European settlement. So as we gather here today, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and their living culture. We pay our respects to them and for their care of the land and how much they have taught us and are teaching us. We pay tribute to the unique role they play in the life of this region. May we walk gently and respectfully on this land.
Thank you very much, Margaret. And now I'd like to invite Father Kenneth, who will lead us in prayer. Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks a lot, Kathy. Hello, everyone. Before I say my prayer, we should say good day and a special Father's Day greeting to all you dads. And from the look of the room, granddads might be more appropriate. But it was great to be here with you all. So we pray. God of all creation, we thank you for the blessing this land provides, the life-enhancing space that we call our home. From all around the world we have come, and we've learned to know and love this place. As more recent arrivals, we honour those ancient nations who have lived and cared for this land from time beyond memory. There is a care we owe each other, and an injustice that waits to be resolved. Through the upcoming referendum, may we step out with courage, respect and common decency, so that our First Nations peoples may come to live as they would wish among the many peoples who now share this ancient land. We pray this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thanks, Kev. That's the reverse. So, we now have a date. On October 14th, we will be posed with this question: a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve the proposed alteration? So the purpose of this event this afternoon is to be informed, or perhaps to be better informed, to reflect and to discuss our position on this question. I think it's probably pretty obvious based on the prayer, based on the invitation to donate to the Yes 23 campaign, that this event definitely supports the answer of yes to that question. Having said that though, it's obviously very important to make a well-informed decision, and we talk in our Catholic tradition about an informed conscience, and this is definitely one of those examples. I think this is a question about our identity as a nation. It's about the identity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It's about our identity as a faith community. But ultimately, it's about our personal identity. In the Gospel of last Sunday, Jesus posed this question to his disciples: who do you say I am? And I think that's a question we have to always ask ourselves as well. Who am I? A couple of months ago, the Marist Family Justice, Peace and Integrity Creation Committee, made up of representatives from all 5 branches of the Marist family, the sisters, the missionary sisters, the fathers, the brothers and laity, decided that the most pressing issue in our times is the referendum on the voice to Parliament. And so we were delighted and happily surprised that when we asked Kerry O'Brien to help us, he said yes. I don't know that Kerry needs much of an introduction, but you're going to get it anyway, Kerry. Kerry is, of course, a preeminent Australian journalist who, for decades, don't want to stress that, Kerry, but
It's pretty obvious.
has for decades been at the forefront of truth-telling about all aspects, really, about Australian society, whether it be politics, society, culture and Indigenous affairs. Kerry, we are very grateful for your leadership in the national conversation on this question and very grateful for your presence with us today. Welcome, Kerry. So, how will this afternoon proceed? Just to begin with a couple of logistical matters. The bathrooms are that way. If you're not familiar with the hall and you're wanting to use the bathrooms, just head in that direction. And if we need to evacuate for any reason, it's that way. And we've got the doors open. Don't confuse those two directions. This afternoon will be in 3 phases. We're going to have round 1 of Q&A, and I want to thank you if you posed a question when you were registering. We got over 30. So we're not going to be able to pose every question in the way that you necessarily framed it. We have kind of synthesised those, drawn out some key themes, and we will hopefully get to the heart of what this referendum concerns. After we've posed some questions, we're going to pause. We're going to have a bit of time for our own reflection and some conversation. There will be a chance at that point to pose additional questions. I can't guarantee where we'll be up to in terms of posing those to Kerry, but we will see how we go. I will acknowledge to you that I am moderator, and I will be not so much vetting the questions, but trying to pose them. I think we've all been in occasions where someone gets the microphone and it's really more about their commentary rather than their questions. So, too bad, I've got the microphone today. Okay, after some time for reflection and conversation, and just that deeper internalising for ourselves, we'll then have round 2 of the questions. Kerry, I think, needs to lead by 3 or thereabouts. Yeah, so that's our sort of time frame. So, without any further ado, we will now go to some of these questions that have been posed. Afternoon, Kerry.
Afternoon, Cathy.
So, Kerry.
I must say I'm really reassured that apart from a handful or a sprinkling of people, I can see that I'm talking to my demographic. We're all going to go together.
Where we're going to go?
That's what I'm waiting to find out.
That's right. So, Kerry, what do you think is really at the heart of the referendum, and why is this issue so important to you personally?
Okay, well, to me, what is at the heart of it, behind the words, and behind even the meaning of the words to me, are some sentiments that are profound. What we're talking about, first of all, is really simple. It is straightforward. But it is about fairness. It is about righting the wrongs. It is about trying to move this country closer to a genuine reconciliation, to a genuine understanding of the true history of our nation, and of what an extraordinarily positive and rich contribution that Indigenous people have in their thrall to make to us all. But most of all, and it goes to something that I find so sad in what we are considering and what we're trying to address, and that is that probably the most constant refrain from Aboriginal communities, whether they be small, whether they be individuals living in urban or regional or our most remote centres, is the refrain, we just want to be heard. We just want to be heard. And I find that gut-wrenching when I actually stop to think about what individuals have experienced, what their ancestors have experienced, what their living relatives have experienced, that takes them to that sad refrain, we just want to be heard. The thing to absolutely start with is that this has got nothing to do with politicians. This has got nothing to do with governments, other than the fact that at this time, this one particular government is facilitating a process. But that process has been set up by Indigenous Australians. It's been a very long process, and if you want to nail the history, it actually goes back in a formal sense to the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, leading up to that referendum, where Indigenous people had to establish their own voice because governments certainly weren't looking to create the opportunity for one. So there were these different activist moments, 20s, 30s, 40s and so on, different groups, and the groups would fire up and sometimes they'd last for 2 or 3 years, and often the reason they didn't survive was because of a process of intimidation at various levels of authority that essentially drove them underground again. But then came the process leading up to the 67 referendum, and the most extraordinary group of people like Faith Bandler, if anyone of you know of Faith Bandler and her background. But there was more than a handful of articulate, passionate, and indeed in some part angry Indigenous Australians who raised the pressure levels to a point where the federal parliament embraced the idea of that referendum to do 2 things: to alter the constitution, to give national governments the power to make policy on Indigenous matters, because hitherto it had been all about the states. And the Feds had some input to the Northern Territory, for instance, and to a much lesser extent the ACT. Well, it was less relevant, the ACT. But the states basically ran their own race in this regard. And so that very obvious responsibility was established legally and in the national rule book for the first time. The second thing, which is, you shake your head when you actually think about this, but in the writing of the Constitution in the first place, Indigenous people were essentially written out of it. They weren't counted. Yes, in some states where Indigenous people had the vote, there was some kind of a count up to a point of Indigenous people. But as a formal right and a formal recognition of the presence of Indigenous people in this country, Indigenous people did not have the right even to be counted in the census. So those 2 things were corrected in that referendum, and incidentally that referendum had bipartisan support, and to this day it remains the highest yes vote in our history of referenda in this country. And as Gough Whitlam pointed out, as only Gough could or would, he wrote that there was only one electoral subdivision in Australia where the no vote prevailed. So what a massive outcome that was, and what an irony it is that as Indigenous people seek to have the follow-up, the obvious, given our history between 67 and now, the obvious follow-up to that referendum. How ironic and how sadly ironic it is that that we are seeing attempts to divide this nation over what should be a civil discussion amongst us all. And in saying that there should be a civil discussion amongst us all, quite apart from the fact that it appeals to our better angels, I think that, and this is not just a subjective judgment, this is based on all the analytical skills I can bring to bear. I think that the intellectual argument, putting the emotional argument to one side, but the intellectual argument for the yes vote is so undeniable to me that I would be confident, fully confident, that if we were capable in this nation of having a civil debate around the land, I have absolutely no doubt that there would be a resounding yes. In terms of why I have become personally involved, I've been a journalist for 55 years, like practically all of my generation. I finished in Queensland at that time, it was called senior, is now the HSC, so I finished my HSC in 1962, and it was true in 1962 that I can remember two sentences in my schooling, my entire schooling, two sentences in a social studies book that acknowledged the existence of Aboriginal people, and there was a sort of faded photo, the classic stereotypical photo of the noble savage with the spear silhouetted, standing beside a gunya with one foot upon his other knee, and a couple of sentences that went with it that talked about nomads. So this entire nation, outside of the Indigenous component, was ignorant of our true history, and Bill Stanner, who was the preeminent anthropologist of his time, delivered the Boyer Lectures, the ABC's Boyer Lectures in 1968, and he titled his lectures The Great Australian Silence. And what he likened the situation to, he talked about a window looking out on the Australian landscape that was positioned in such a way that a very substantial and significant part of that landscape was missing. No matter what angle you looked out on that landscape, you could not see that significant part of our history. Well, I had a very sharp learning curve. I went to Alice Springs in 1970 as a very young journalist, not for a story that had anything to do with Indigenous people, but I spent my time there walking the streets and talking to people, and I was absolutely shocked to my core by what I saw and what I heard. Racism in the most appalling illustrations, undeniable. And it was as a result of one of the people that I met while I was there, a Uniting Church minister named Jim Downing, one of the most decent human beings I've ever met in my life. Had come from Redfern in Sydney to, as it turned out, give the rest of his life to Indigenous people. And he had taken the trouble to learn the Pitjantjatjara language. And I rang Jim 5 years later, when I had just started at Four Corners for the first time, still young, and asked Jim what was going on around the place. He told me about a case that was in the that had only just finished the prosecution stages, and he put me onto a young white lawyer named Jeff Eames, who was running the then fledgling Aboriginal Legal Service. And Jeff subsequently became a Supreme Court judge in Victoria and was the counsel assisting the Royal Commission into black deaths in custody years later. So between the two of them, they presented this case to me and I did a story on it. It was about a young Indigenous woman named Paula Sweet who had been brutally bashed and died 2 days later in hospital. And the police had rounded up 6 Indigenous men, very young men, they were boys still really, I met them subsequently, who were charged. They allegedly made confessions. They were charged, they were committed for trial, and they ended up in jail for about 5 or 6 months before the Supreme Court trial was thrown out. It was thrown out mostly on Jim Downing's evidence as a speaker of their language and the myriad examples he was able to show to demonstrate that they could not possibly have made those confessions. The confessions were an absolute mockery, and the police, in their ignorance, had basically fingered themselves because they didn't know the language, of course, and so therefore they did not know that a word like murder had a very different connotation if you tried to translate it to Pidgin. And the judge made some comments that were savage in their criticism, but then in the next breath he was sort of half letting the police off. The result of that case, apart from the fact that the true murderer, who was Paula Sweet's de facto partner, let me put it this way, he was so demonstrably the obvious suspect who disappeared while the police were rounding up the Aboriginals, and he had four. So he disappeared. But the big thing was that the Whitlam government announced a Royal Commission into black deaths, not black deaths in custody. It was a preamble to it, really. It was the relations between police and Indigenous people in the Northern Territory. I'm going a long way, Cathy, so I'll round up. But this is such a big topic. This is huge. And so much to tell. But 5 weeks after that Royal Commission was announced, Gough sank, Malcolm Fraser came in. The Royal Commission never happened, it just disappeared. 12 years later, I was sitting around a committee table in the old Parliament House when Bob Hawke walked in as Prime Minister, and it was obvious that he was extremely reluctant in doing this. But after about 18 months of intense pressure, he was persuaded, and he announced a Royal Commission into black deaths in custody, and that was as a result of another four-corner story, a reporter named David Marr, into some savage black deaths in custody in Western Australia. So the outcome of that Royal Commission, 338 recommendations. If those recommendations, if the Royal Commission of black deaths, the first one had taken place, things might have begun to be different in the Territory so much sooner. If the 330, even if 50% of the 338 recommendations of the Black Deaths in Custody Royal Commission had been implemented, things would be different in Australia today. But what's the story? So many of those recommendations have been ignored by the states who would be doing the implementing. And we are still seeing black deaths in custody today in outrageous numbers. Now, it's an illustration of the wider picture of how Indigenous policy is made and the impacts of those policies. And I can tell you, the policies that have failed, that have cost billions and billions of dollars, when you follow the thread, they have failed because Indigenous people have not been listened to. Either they haven't been asked, or they've been asked and not listened to. And when Marcia Langton and Tom Calma, the two people who, after the Uluru Statement from the Heart, went around Australia on another consultation process with 110 Indigenous communities, over 10,000 people. I heard Marcia, I said, Thomas Mayo and I gave evidence on the first day of the Parliamentary Joint Committee that was looking at the proposed words to go into the referendum and coming up with a recommendation of the government. Marcia Langton and Tom Calma gave evidence that day, and I remember Marcia saying, wherever they went in any of those communities, they heard the same story again and again. Bureaucrats, fly in, fly out bureaucrats, they call them. They fly in and pull out their pads and their pens, or these days their computers. They'd take lots of notes, they'd ask lots of questions, they'd even make some promises. They'd fly out and either never be heard from again, or the policy that would come filtering back would be no relationship to the advice they'd do. So just quickly, and I'm probably answering some of the other questions in the process, Cathy. The other thing that I bring to this, and the reason it was so easy for me to say yes when Thomas Mayo asked me if I'd co-write this book with him, is that I have seen and lived the history. You know, you do get a privileged ringside seat to history when you are a journalist, particularly if you're a journalist who understands the importance of the craft, as many do. And you might not actually, you're not always thinking, oh Jesus, This is history being made here, because so often it can seem so mundane. But having seen, as a close witness, the history of the development of Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations, Indigenous policy, Indigenous affairs, what I have seen, amongst other things, all those milestone moments like Mabo and Wick and land rights and so on, what has been a constant has there been, after the first voice, Indigenous voice, was formed to Parliament with Gough Whitlam, called the NACC. I won't bother with those details, but it was called the NACC, and there were 41 people who were to be elected from their communities, representing Indigenous communities around Australia. They were given the role to reflect advice from those communities back to the government. That was the first voice that involved Indigenous people, formally and officially, within the channels of power of this country. In '67, when Harold Holt, as Prime Minister, had to wonder what on earth he was going to do, and in fact his first minister was a guy named Seb Barnes, a Queenslander. He was Country Party then, National Party. And somehow he was Minister for Territories, I think, or Interior, so it became his responsibility. Someone a couple of months after the referendum said to him, "Well, Seb, what are you planning?" He said, "Well, to be honest, I don't know." They were so remote, even after that referendum, our politicians, and it wasn't just one side, you know, our politicians were so remote from this, the vast bulk of them were assimilationists. There was this belief threaded through our colonial and post-colonial history that Indigenous people would die out. There was this term that was called smoothing the dying pillow. Are any of you familiar with that term? Smoothing the dying pillow, which reflected the belief we should put Indigenous people on missions and in reserves for their protection while we wait for them to die out. And if you had some white blood in you, then there's half a chance you could be redeemed. And then right through the official language are terms like quadroons and octoroons. And believe me, for those of you who don't know it or who haven't read a lot of Indigenous history, including the Stolen Generations report, it's blood-curdling to actually look at the intent and the meaning of the words that you see written into the official record around the states. So, the particularly relevant point I want to make in being that witness to history is that from Gough's NACC to what became Malcolm Fraser's NAC, with 35 rather than 41 representatives and different rules for election, and then subsequently in the Hawke government the NAC disappeared, and 2 or 3 years later the ASIC emerged. And ASIC was the first really substantial body established by government as an interface between Indigenous communities and the policy makers in Canberra. And ASIC actually achieved some great things. But ASIC was always on borrowed time when John Howard replaced Paul Keating as Prime Minister, because John Howard had said when he was voting against ASIC in 1988 in the Parliament that he would always oppose ASIC. They likened it, he and his colleagues likened it to a black parliament. I've actually got Howard's words here in a speech in that ASIC debate. I take the opportunity of saying again that if the government wants to divide Australia against Australia, if it wants to create a black nation within the Australian nation, it should go ahead with its Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission legislation. In the process, it will be doing a monumental disservice to the Australian community. The ASIC legislation strikes at the heart of the unity of Australian people. I have to say this, and it's a personal view. It's a personal view based on long observation. I always enjoyed conversations with John Howard. We had a civil relationship. But in my well thought through reflections on that time in office, I think John Howard, to me, was the most divisive Prime Minister of my lifetime. Other people can have different views and I'll respect that. That's mine. John Howard comes to office and immediately the funding is reduced for ATSIC. And I can tell you personally, there was a chipping away process that went on over years trying to discredit ATSIC. I had ministers who would ring me and say, did you know about this guy who might be a commissioner of ATSIC? Did you know what's going on here? And my answer to them always was, if you can see something wrong, then why aren't we hearing about it from you? They didn't want to do that. They didn't want to do it publicly. They didn't want to do it honestly. And partly, my view of that is because ATSIC, for many, many Australians, was working, and particularly for Indigenous Australians, it was working. In any event, John Howard got rid of ATSIC entirely. And it took him a long time, that sort of white-handing that went on over time. And it was only after Mark Latham, when he became leader of the opposition, announced that Labor would also withdraw support for ATSIC, that John Howard then moved on it. He moved on it despite the fact that a review committee that he established himself, that was led by a former Liberal Attorney General of New South Wales, a man named John Hamilton. And when that review was announced, everybody in the gallery, everybody in the Parliament assumed that that was the beginning of the end, and that the end result of that would be that the review would find that ATSIC should be axed and Howard would exit. The review found that ATSIC should stay, that ATSIC should remain, that it was fundamentally a worthwhile body, that it was losing its connection, that its connections to the regions were becoming more remote, and that should be corrected and fixed. But ATSIC should survive. And the minister at the time, Amanda Vanstone, has subsequently said that it was wrong to axe it. So, since then we've seen a checkerboard of the same thing. So the point is, no permanency, no capacity to evolve, no capacity to mature, no capacity to learn from mistakes. And that is the story of all the institutions that really underpin our democracy. They've had their chance to evolve and become strong institutions, as I have no doubt ATSIC would have become. So at the heart of this is a sense of a guarantee that the voice will be ongoing, that any future voice to Parliament will be ongoing, that it will have the guarantee through the rule book of the nation of permanence. The Parliament retains the power to determine what form it will take. It will continue to have the power to determine what resources it will have. And it will decide. Government, when government gets a recommendation from the voice, it will look at that. Hopefully it will consider it properly, not just pretend to. It will go through, it will be the Indigenous recommendations on a particular policy that might relate to health or education or housing or whatever, that the Indigenous proposals for that are presented as part of the Cabinet debate around that policy issue. And if the policy is being rejected or only a part of the policy is being enshrined, the explanations as to why not. And then it goes to the Parliament and goes through that whole process. 2 houses of Parliament, review committees in both houses of Parliament, public debate, public transparency, and then we see the legislation. So the actual referendum itself is very straightforward. We're only voting on whether we give this recognition to the 65,000 years of continuous civilisation and the right of Indigenous people as the first Australians who laid the foundation for the rest of us over all those many thousands of years to be heard. They have no veto. They're not going to engage in frivolous court cases. Why would they? If they actually get this right delivered to them, why on earth? Really? Why are they going to do that? And those things have all been refuted, but we'll come to that later. Cathy, I've blown your time out because I've spoken for so long, but you can see these things, one thread leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. I have utter conviction about this. I've spent so much of my lifetime as a journalist. I've reported all of the big issues and many others in between, across all those programs I've worked on, and the readings I've had to do for those things. You don't do an interview with a John Howard or a Paul Keating or a Bob Hawke or a Barack Obama or a Nelson Mandela without doing the spade work, because otherwise you end up with egg on your face very publicly, and it's not a good feeling. and I have utter conviction about this that it's the right thing to do.
You have a swig there, Kerry, you've earned it. I'll just chuck my questions out now. No, I'm thinking there are still some things to probe that Kerry hasn't covered. And Kerry, if the worst you say is Jesus, you're safe.
I didn't get to the second S.
Yeah, I think I've said worse myself.
Cathy, the one thing that I pulled up from my Catholic past, I think it's in the book, when I was trying to explain how I saw things, and it so resonated with me and it so stayed with me that we should treat others the way we want them to treat us. Is that not doesn't that just puts it right there? We want others to treat us the way we want to treat others the way we want them to treat us. If you sort of have that in the forefront of your mind, it kind of sets your whole path through life, doesn't it?
And that's why I think you said Jesus, Kerry.
Exactly.
Just a bit of quoting, really. So I think the fact, Kerry, the fact that you do embody so much of this history, but as well as your human story, I think that's what will really stay with us. Whether we get through every bit of every question, we can research some of that ourselves, but you've given us a great...
Or just read the book.
That's right. You've given us a great historical context there, but with yourself in it for those 55 years. So that's priceless and unique, I think. I don't know that we'd be able to find anyone else who could give us that. However, I will go to one or two of these questions. Let's hope that the referendum is successful and it's a yes, and we hear about the group giving the Parliament advice. So one of our questions is, can the voice have real muscle and make a really meaningful impact that will make a genuine difference for our First Nations people, do you think?
Well, I think the part about the existence of the voice having been delivered by all of us in what I think is the purest expression of our democracy and the most straightforward expression of our democracy, a question is asked and you only get to answer yes or no, or maybe, vote informally, which is a little harder to do. But if we get that yes vote, then it gives the body that would be formed subsequently a moral and political authority that would lend weight to what they do. And I was interested to see John Howard the other day. He was trying to use it as a sort of weapon against a yes vote by saying that that if the voice was passed on a referendum, it would make it so powerful that no Parliament could possibly deny it. Well, that's not so, but he's touching on that aspect that I'm saying, that the moral and political weight would be there as a result of the vote. But the other part of the equation, which is actually the most important part of the equation, is that voice will only be as effective as the quality of the advice reflects it. It will have to have an integrity. It will have to genuinely reflect the views of those Indigenous communities around the country. It will have to be well argued, and it will also be transparent. So those are the two things that give you a good head start. But I want to also read from a paper written by Fiona Stanley, Dr. or Professor Fiona Stanley, an eminent epidemiologist and paediatrician who has done an enormous amount of work across her field, but particularly also within Indigenous Australian communities. And she says, the data are clear and important for our response to the Uluru Statement calling for a voice. There is international evidence now that the pathways to poor health in First Nations populations worldwide commence early and emerge from social disadvantage, no surprise there, and include forced removals of children from families and land, resulting in ongoing intergenerational trauma. These circumstances and history also influence almost every other pathway. So, as an example, to poor educational outcomes, substance abuse, gambling, child maltreatment, FASD, which is fetal alcohol syndrome, criminal behaviours, incarceration and suicides. This may sound depressing, and it is, but it also opens up fantastic opportunities for First Nations improvements. If we can influence these early pathways, then all outcomes will improve. This is research now. Research from Canada, New Zealand and Australia describe and measure outcomes in communities which have Aboriginal control, in which Aboriginal culture is strong as measured by language, attendance at cultural events, etc., and which have attachment to country. The results are staggering. In such communities, use of services, which are of course tailored to the specific and variable context of First Nation lives, is very high, and health conditions better diagnosed and treated. But the fascinating thing is that the whole population's well-being is improved. In the Nunavut community in Northern Ontario, the results of bringing back Aboriginal birthing included better birth outcomes as predicted, but also increases in self-esteem, reduced domestic violence, substance abuse, and more children ready for and attending school. These outcomes were not predicted by the funding of those services. And this is Health Canada, British Columbia and so on. A study of youth suicide in all the Aboriginal tribal tracts across the provinces over 20 years showed some communities with very high rates and some with no suicides at all. Those with no suicides had strong Aboriginal councils, language and Aboriginal control services, health education and so on. Giving First Nations people a voice is cost effective. It is economic best practice. Last bit, important. The expensive failure of most federal and state territory government programs for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia is a tragedy. It is not only a huge waste of money, but in some circumstances is causing more trauma, more illness, more suicides and more incarcerations, while most Aboriginal services and activities that are government funded have to prove evaluations of effectiveness. Few government-run programs do, in spite of it being obvious that they are often useless. Now, we've got examples in the book, simple examples in the book, where Indigenous voices have been listened to on policy relating to Indigenous communities. The results have been resoundingly positive. I won't go into any more of those now, but Fiona Stanley, believe me, is the gold standard. So you get the voice function, you get it coming up from the ground level with quality, with credibility, with integrity, going through those policy development processes of government coming out the other side. I have absolutely no doubt we will begin to see the gaps starting to close. And it won't happen overnight, and it won't be universal across the board, but it will start to happen. And I am not hearing a single suggestion from the other side about what they're going to do that's going to change things if we don't get the voice. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, and about 14 others. So if I do refer to the questions here, for example, one of them was about why is there really a need for a voice to Parliament and not just constitutional recognition. I think Kerry has spoken about that. I asked the question about how can it have that meaningful impact, and another question was about, well, what practical impacts will the voice have? and I think Fiona Stanley's quote did that for us. Kerry's referred a few times to budgeting and the whole money aspect of things, and just the billions of dollars that have been wasted effectively in projects that have failed. So I think that's the sort of sad news, and then it's how might that money be spent more fruitfully, and I think we've had some examples from Fiona Stanley as well. So I think at this point we are going to pause. I will preempt a little bit about where we're going to go. The kind of good thing is as well as having a date, we do now have the official referendum booklet, which we know was not fact-checked. So, you know, put your blinkers on when you're reading that. And so I am going to, I've identified about 6 areas in that booklet, the arguments for the no case, and I am going to put those areas to Kerry for his comment. So that is sort of where we're going, and also how we might support the yes case in our own communities, our own families, etc. So at this stage though, one of the tricky things with occasions like this is there's a wealth of information, and it's about how much do we take with us. So let's all take a deep breath. Okay. And now I'm going to just pose some questions to you for your reflection. So this will take a few minutes. You might like to close your eyes or just focus on a spot in front of you as I go through some of these questions for your reflection. Firstly, from what we've heard so far, what is staying with you? I've got a few little subsets to that question. What have you heard today that has confirmed your thinking? What have you heard today that may have surprised you? And what have you heard today that may have challenged you? So in a moment there'll be an opportunity, if you like, for your voice and just some conversation with the people nearby. And at this stage, if you wish to add a question, if you've come here with some sort of burning issue that we haven't yet addressed and I haven't sort of forecast, then there'll be some people around with some little sticky notes and pens. Feel free to write down your question. They'll come back to me, and then we'll just sort of see where we end up. So 2 things: an opportunity to talk amongst yourselves, and if you have a question, can you just raise your hand and someone will go to you with pen and paper, and you can write that down and get it back to us. So I think Mark's going to help with that. Bo, maybe Andrew on his vehicle. Yeah, so over to you now just to talk about this issue.